Have you ever just stopped and thought about how much power a single word can have? How one little label can totally shape the way we see morality, history, even our idea of God? Well, today we're going to pull apart one of the heaviest words in the English language, and we're going to find out that its story is not at all what it seems. So, let's dive in.
All right, let's just jump right in with a really challenging question. What if the word we use for the worst things imaginable, the word evil, is actually the wrong word? What if it's a concept that we've layered onto ancient texts, and in doing so, we've kind of changed what they originally meant? That's the puzzle we're going to try to solve together today. For most of us, right, when we hear the word evil, our brain immediately jumps to this idea. We think of profound, deliberate, conscious wickedness. It's a purely moral thing, you know? It's rooted in big stories like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where evil is the absolute opposite of good. So that's our starting point. That's the modern idea we all kind of share. But now, we're going to go back in time.
Okay, first things first. Before we can understand where we're going, we've got to understand where we came from. And believe it or not, the history of our own word, evil, holds a really fascinating clue.
So our English word, evil, actually comes from this Old English word, euphile. And what's super interesting is the definition. Notice it's not just about morality. It's about anything that causes injury, morally or physically. So right from the get-go, even in our own language, this concept was tied to real physical harm, not just some abstract idea of being bad.
And this just perfectly illustrates a really cool idea about language. Our deepest moral words are basically built on metaphors of physical damage. Evil comes from this idea of something being split apart or broken. The word bad is linked to something spoiling, like rotten food. Our abstract idea of moral corruption is anchored in the very real, very physical experience of things falling apart, breaking down, or being destroyed. Now, hang on to that idea of breaking. It's going to be important later.
Okay, so we've looked at English. Now let's pivot and jump way back into the ancient world. We're going to look at the original Hebrew word that almost always gets translated as evil in the Old Testament. And you're about to see it's operating in a completely different universe of meaning. The word is ra. And get this, it shows up over 600 times in the Hebrew Bible. But trying to force this word into our English box of evil, it's like trying to fit a star into a square hole. You just lose almost everything that makes it special. A simple one-to-one translation, it just doesn't work. So what does ra actually mean then? Well, the verb it comes from gives us our first huge clue. It's all about active disruption. Think about breaking something, crushing it, or a loud jarring noise that just shatters the piece. The core idea here is disturbance, chaos, disorder, the complete opposite of calm, stable harmony. And see, there's that breaking idea again. But in Hebrew, this concept is way broader.
And this, right here, brings us to the absolute game changer of this whole explainer. To really get what Ara is all about, we have to switch our thinking entirely, away from a moral framework and into a functional one. This is the key that unlocks everything.
You see, in ancient Hebrew thought, the main way of looking at the world wasn't really moral versus immoral. It was more like functional versus dysfunctional. The opposite of ra is a word called tov. When God creates the world in Genesis and says it is tov, he's not just saying it's morally good. He's saying it works. It's functional, it's harmonious, it's doing exactly what it was designed to do. So it follows that ra is anything that disrupts that function. It's chaos, it's calamity, it's anything that's harmful or just isn't fit for its purpose.
And this is where you can really see just how huge and flexible this idea of ra is. I mean, look at this. It can describe physical ugliness, like the skinny, unhealthy cows in Pharaoh's dream. They weren't immoral, they were dysfunctional. They signaled a coming famine. It can be a natural disaster, like a plague. That's a calamity. It can even be an emotion, like when Nehemiah had a sad face. And yeah, of course, it can also describe what we would call moral evil, wicked actions. But that's just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle.
So, here's the crucial point. The word ra is used to describe all sorts of things we would never, ever call evil. I mean, are rotten figs immoral? Is contaminated water wicked? No way, of course not. They are dysfunctional. They are unfit for their purpose. They're harmful. They are ra. The word describes a state of ruin, not just a moral choice.
Okay, so what happens when we take this new tool, this new lens of function versus dysfunction, and we apply it to some of the most famous and sometimes difficult stories in the Bible? Well, the result is pretty transformative.
Let's start with the big one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the Hebrew word for knowledge here implies intimate, first-hand experience, not just learning facts from a book. So eating from this tree wasn't about learning a list of moral rules. It was about choosing to personally experience the full spectrum of reality. Not just Tov, the functional, harmonious, life-giving order of God's world, but also Ra, the chaotic, calamitous, dysfunctional consequences of breaking away from that order.
Now for what might be one of the most challenging verses in the entire Bible. When you read this verse from Isaiah through our modern English lens, it sounds really problematic. It seems to be saying that God is the author of moral evil. And yeah, this verse really forces the question head-on. If Ra really means evil in the way we think of it, does this mean God is the source of all wickedness? This has been a huge theological headache for centuries. But our new framework gives us a really clear way through it. Let's just compare the two options side by side. If God creates evil, it feels like a major contradiction. But if God creates calamity, well, that makes perfect sense. The verse is setting up pairs of opposites, light and darkness, peace and what? The opposite of peace isn't wickedness, it's disaster, distress, chaos. And in fact, if you pick up most modern Bible translations, you'll see they don't even use the word evil here anymore. They'll say disaster, calamity, or woe, which perfectly captures that functional meaning of Ra.
So after this whole journey through ancient words and big ideas, where does that leave us? What's the big takeaway from all of this? How does this shift in perspective actually matter?
It all really boils down to this one key difference. Our modern English idea of evil is a pretty narrow, specific moral judgment. It's all about intent and profound wickedness. But the ancient Hebrew concept of Ra is this huge, practical, functional category that can describe any state of disorder, ruin, or dysfunction, whether it's in a person's heart, a bucket of water, or the fate of an entire nation.
And that leaves us with a final question to just chew on. What changes for us when we start thinking not just in terms of good versus evil, but in terms of function versus dysfunction? How does that change the way we see problems in the world, how we think about solutions, how we understand the very fabric of reality? It suggests that maybe the ultimate struggle isn't just against malice, but against chaos itself. Something to think about.